All right, get ready to dive deep. Today, we're tackling Romans 1.132.
Oh, an excellent choice.
We've got theological frameworks, commentaries, study guides, the whole works.
Wow, quite the spread.
And our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to figure out how this passage can be used to teach, well, everyone, really.
Adults and children alike.
Exactly.
Yeah,
About the Christian faith.
that's quite the challenge.
It is, but that's what makes it so fascinating, right?
Yeah,
And what's really interesting is how Paul, the author of Romans, just jumps right in.
he does, doesn't he?
Just waste any time.
Not a single breath.
He introduces himself, but not just as Paul.
Right, he's very specific.
He's a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle.
It's like he's laying down his credentials right from the start.
Exactly. It's like he's saying, listen up, people, I've got authority here.
I'm not just some random guy with an opinion.
I've got a message straight from the top.
Precisely. And that message, of course, is the gospel.
The good news.
The good news indeed.
But here's the thing that always gets me about this passage.
What's that?
It's considered one of the most challenging sections in the entire Bible,
It's dense, that's for sure.
especially when we get to those verses about God's wrath and human depravity.
Yeah, those are tough ones.
So how do we reconcile those ideas with this whole good news thing?
That is the question, isn't it?
And how on earth do we explain that to kids?
Well, I think the first step is understanding the historical context.
Okay, let's back up a bit.
So Paul is writing to the Roman Church,
Right, a group of believers living in Rome.
a very diverse group, actually.
And Rome at that time was, well,
Let's just say it wasn't exactly known for its piety.
not exactly a Sunday school picnic.
It was a society steeped in paganism and immorality.
So Paul isn't just throwing out some abstract theological concepts.
No, not at all.
He's addressing real issues faced by real people.
Exactly. People struggling with temptations, surrounded by ungodliness.
People trying to figure out how to live their faith in a very challenging world.
It's like he's giving them a roadmap for navigating a minefield.
And by setting the stage this way, he provides a framework for understanding the rest of the letter.
He's saying, look, even in a world full of darkness,
There's hope.
and that hope is found in the gospel.
Now, you might be listening to this and thinking, what exactly is the gospel?
It's a word we throw around a lot, but what does it actually mean?
It sounds kind of ominous, like some ancient warning,
Like a prophecy of doom.
but it's actually the opposite, right?
It is, it is.
So what is it?
Gospel literally means good news.
Okay, that makes more sense.
And for Paul, the good news is this. God has provided a way for humanity to be reconciled to him.
To be brought back into a right relationship with him.
Yes, and it's through Jesus Christ.
This is where we get into this whole idea of justification by faith.
One of the cornerstones of Christian theology,
It's huge, but it can be tough to wrap your head around.
especially if you're coming from a background where you're used to earning your way.
Right, like you have to prove yourself worthy.
Yeah, but justification by faith flips that whole script on its head,
It's like saying you're accepted, not because of what you've done.
but because of who you believe in.
Mind-blowing, right?
It goes against every human instinct we have.
We want to earn our way to check off the boxes.
We want to say, look, God, see how good I've been.
But Paul is saying, nope, it's a gift.
Freely given, unearned.
Through faith in Jesus.
And that's why Paul hammers this point home so hard.
Because he knew his audience would struggle with it.
He knew they'd be tempted to think, surely I have to do something to earn God's favor.
Maybe if I pray enough or give enough money or follow all the rules perfectly.
But Paul is saying, no, it's not about what you do.
It's about what Christ has already done.
It's a radical concept, and it's one that still challenges us today.
It's good news, for sure.
The best news there is.
But then Paul throws this curveball.
He does, doesn't he?
He goes from this beautiful message of grace and hope.
To this intense section about God's wrath.
It's like he slams on the brakes.
From hope to judgment.
It's jarring, to say the least.
And it raises all sorts of questions, especially when we're thinking about how to teach this to children.
Right? Like, how do we explain that without scaring them off?
It's a delicate balance.
But it's important to remember that Paul isn't being vindictive here.
No, not at all.
He's not some angry deity looking to punish people.
He's actually demonstrating God's justice.
Okay, I'm listening.
Paul's argument is this. God's existence and his attributes are evident in creation itself.
So we're talking about the beauty of nature, the order of the universe.
Exactly. The very fact that we exist at all points to a creator.
So when people choose to ignore or reject God, They're not just making a theological mistake.
They're rejecting something that's plainly obvious.
They're suppressing the truth.
And that has consequences.
He even uses the phrase, without excuse.
Pretty strong words.
It's like he's saying, you can't pretend you don't know God exists.
The evidence is all around you?
And that's where this idea of God's wrath comes in.
Right. It's not about God being angry or vengeful.
It's about the natural consequences of rejecting truth.
Of choosing to live in darkness.
So the bad news is intrinsically linked to the good news.
Two sides of the same coin.
If we reject the offer of reconciliation through Christ,
If we choose to go our own way.
we're essentially choosing the consequences that come with that rejection.
We can't have it both ways.
We can't reap the benefits of a relationship with God.
Without acknowledging him as Lord.
Powerful stuff.
It is, and it's something we need to grapple with.
As adults.
And as we teach children about faith.
Now, there's a phrase in this passage that always kind of freaks me out a little.
Oh, which one?
Reprobate mind.
Ah, yes. That one tends to raise some eyebrows.
It sounds like something out of a horror movie.
Like a curse or something.
But it's important to understand what Paul means by that, right?
Absolutely. We can't just throw these terms around without unpacking them.
So what does he mean?
Paul uses this phrase to describe a state of mind.
Okay, a state of mind.
A mind that has become so corrupted by sin
Corrupted how?
that it loses the ability to discern right from wrong.
It's like their moral compass is broken.
Exactly. It's a downward spiral starting with the rejection of God.
And leading to increasingly distorted thinking and behavior.
Like a snowball rolling downhill, gathering more and more snow as it goes.
So it's not that God gives people a reprobate mind as some sort of punishment.
No, it's not like God is zapping people with evil.
It's more like a consequence of their own choices.
A hardening of the heart that happens over time.
As they repeatedly reject truth and embrace sin,
The more we say no to God
the harder it becomes to hear his voice.
and to recognize his truth.
That's a sobering thought.
It is, and it's one we'll explore further in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned, folks.
This is just the beginning.
Back again for more Romans 1.132. Man, we really jumped into the deep end with this one, huh?
We did. It's a pretty intense passage.
God's wrath, human depravity, reprobate mind, heavy stuff.
It is, but it's also incredibly relevant, even today.
That's what I keep coming back to, Like, how do we take these ancient ideas and make them meaningful for people today?
Especially when you're trying to teach this to both adults and children.
Yeah, exactly. Like, where's the bridge between Paul's world and ours?
Well, I think one of the key bridges is this concept of idolatry.
Idolatry. You mean like bowing down to statues and stuff?
That's the classic image, sure, but Paul takes it a step further.
He does, doesn't he?
He argues that anything can become an idol.
Anything. Really?
Anything that we put before God, anything that becomes the ultimate object of our affection and devotion.
So it's not just about the physical act of worshiping something other than God.
It's about what we prioritize, what we give our hearts to.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how this connects to the modern world.
Right. We might not have golden calves in our living rooms.
But we certainly have our own versions of idols, don't we?
Absolutely. Think about our obsession with social media, the pursuit of wealth and status.
The constant need for validation, the pressure to keep up with the Joneses.
All of those things can become idols in our lives.
Things that we end up worshiping, even if we don't realize it.
Things that take the place of God in our hearts.
So you might be thinking, okay, so I like nice things. I enjoy a good Instagram post. Is that really so bad?
It's not about saying we can't enjoy those things. It's about where they fall on our priority list.
Right. It's about what we make the center of our lives.
Because when we make those things the center, when we elevate them above God,
They distort our thinking. They lead us astray.
it's like a downward spiral,
a slippery slope.
Exactly. We start by rejecting God, then we embrace idols.
And that leads to all sorts of unhealthy behaviors and attitudes.
The things that Paul lists in those graphic verses,
The ones that make us squirm a little when we read them.
but they're there for a reason.
They're like warning signs, right?
Exactly. They're showing us the logical progression of what happens when we turn away from God,
When we embrace our own selfish desires.
when we put ourselves on the throne instead of Him.
Okay, so let's pause here for a moment
Take a breath.
and think about how we might teach this concept to both adults and children.
Different approaches for different age groups.
Right, because you can't just drop a 5-year-old into a theological debate about idolatry.
No, definitely not.
But there are ways to make these concepts accessible.
Absolutely. For adults, we can engage in deeper discussions about the nature of idolatry.
How it manifests in our lives today, The pressures of consumerism, the allure of instant gratification.
The temptation to compromise our values for the sake of success or acceptance.
And for children,
We can use stories and examples that resonate with their understanding.
like fairy tales where characters make foolish choices because they're blinded by greed or envy.
Perfect example. Or even something as simple as prioritizing toys or screen time over spending time with family or helping others.
It's about showing them that idolatry isn't just some ancient problem.
It's something we all struggle with, even in our everyday lives.
Man, there's a phrase in this passage that always trips me up.
Oh, which one?
God gave them up.
Ah, yes, that one can be a real head-scratcher.
It sounds like God is abandoning people, like he's giving up on them when they make bad choices.
How do we reconcile that with the idea of a loving and merciful God?
Exactly. And how do we explain that to others, especially children?
Without making God seem harsh or uncaring.
That's the challenge.
It is, but it's an important one to address.
So what's the key here?
The key is understanding that Paul isn't saying that God actively pushes people into sin.
It's not like God is saying, you've messed up too many times, I'm done with you.
Not at all. Remember, God gives us free will.
He allows us to make our own choices, even when those choices lead us away from him.
But then why does Paul say God gave them up?
That's what's so confusing.
He's describing a process, not a sudden event.
Okay, a process.
Think of it like a parent watching their child make destructive choices.
But they know that intervening will only make the child more rebellious.
Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is step back,
Allow the child to experience the natural consequences of their actions.
hoping that it will eventually lead them to make better choices.
So God gave them up isn't about abandonment,
It's about allowing the consequences of sin to play out.
with the hope that it will ultimately lead to repentance and restoration.
Exactly, and that's a really important point to emphasize, especially when teaching children about God's love and justice.
Because we don't want them to think that God is just waiting for them to mess up so he can punish them.
No, God is always drawing us towards himself, even when we're running in the opposite direction.
Okay, I'm starting to see how we can use this passage to have some really meaningful conversations about faith, even with kids,
It's about finding the right language, using relatable examples.
and always emphasizing the hope and love that are at the heart of the gospel.
Well said. And remember, we're not just teaching about Romans 1.132.
We're inviting people to wrestle with the text themselves,
To ask questions, to challenge assumptions.
to discover the truth for themselves.
And that's a journey that can be incredibly rewarding.
Now, we've talked a lot about the consequences of rejecting God,
The downward spiral of sin.
but Paul also talks about the flip side.
The idea that the just shall live by faith.
What does that mean, and how does it fit into all of this?
That phrase is actually a quote from the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk,
Old Testament, okay?
and it's central to Paul's message in Romans.
It's like his thesis statement almost.
Exactly. It highlights the idea that righteousness, being in right standing with God, comes not through our own efforts or good deeds.
But through faith in Jesus Christ.
Exactly. We can't earn our way into God's favor.
So it's not about being perfect or following all the rules.
Nope, because let's be honest, none of us can do that perfectly.
Not even close.
In fact, Paul goes to great lengths to explain that no one can earn their way into God's good graces.
We're all sinners, every one of us.
We all fall short of God's glory.
But through faith in Jesus, we can receive the gift of righteousness.
And be reconciled to God.
That's definitely good news.
Mhm.
But how do we explain this concept to children?
Justification by faith sounds pretty complicated.
It does, doesn't it?
Here's where analogies can be really helpful.
I love a good analogy.
Imagine a child who breaks a valuable vase.
Uh-oh. Sounds like trouble.
They can try to glue it back together, but it will never be the same.
The cracks will always show.
They might even try to hide it, but eventually their parents will find out.
Busted.
The child is guilty, and they know it.
They're in big trouble.
But what if the parents, out of love and mercy, decide to forgive the child?
And buy a new vase?
Exactly. The child doesn't deserve it. They haven't earned it.
But through the parents' grace, they are restored to a place of favor.
That's a beautiful picture of what God does for us through Christ.
Wow, that's a powerful analogy. I can see how that would resonate with a child.
And honestly, it makes it clearer for me too.
It's like we're all that child. We've all broken something precious.
And we can't fix it on our own.
We need God's grace and forgiveness.
And that's what the gospel offers.
A way to be made right with God through faith in Jesus.
Exactly.
So Romans 1.132 is like a two-sided coin, right?
I like that. Two sides of the same coin.
On one side, we see the consequences of rejecting God,
Yeah.
the downward spiral of sin.
And on the other side, the hope of salvation through faith in Christ.
It's both a warning and an invitation.
That's a brilliant way to put it.
It's a reminder that we have a choice to make, a choice with internal consequences,
But ultimately, it's a message of hope and love.
a message that can transform lives, both young and old.
Absolutely.
Okay, this deep dive is really starting to come together,
We've explored the theological framework, unpacked key terms.
and even found ways to make these concepts accessible to both adults and children.
I think we're making good progress.
But I'm still curious, how can we use all of this to actually engage in meaningful conversations about faith?
That's a fantastic question, and one we'll explore more deeply in part 3 of our deep dive.
Get ready to dive even deeper into Romans 1.132. Right, welcome back to our Romans deep dive. Part 3 already, huh?
Time flies when you're wrestling with theological concepts.
It really does. So we've covered a lot of ground so far.
Historical context, key terms, those tricky verses about God's wrath and human depravity.
We even dove into that mind-boggling concept of justification by faith.
We really unpacked it, didn't we?
But now the question is, how do we actually use all of this to teach others about faith?
Right, because it's one thing to understand these ideas ourselves,
It's another thing entirely to communicate them to someone else.
especially in a way that's engaging and meaningful.
And not totally awkward, right?
Especially in today's world where religious conversations can be, well,
Bit of a minefield.
exactly. So how do we even start a conversation about Romans 1.132 without sounding like we're preaching from a soapbox?
Or judging people for not seeing things our way.
That's the key, isn't it? Approaching these conversations with humility
With genuineness.
and a willingness to listen,
Not just to talk at people.
but to truly hear where they're coming from.
Remember, Paul himself wasn't always a follower of Christ.
Right, he was actually a persecutor of Christians before his own radical conversion.
So maybe leading with our own struggles and questions can create a more open space for dialogue.
I think so. It's less intimidating that way.
Instead of presenting ourselves as having all the answers,
We can share our own journey of wrestling with these ideas.
we can say something like, hey, I've been grappling with this passage in Romans.
And I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Makes it more of a shared exploration.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of asking good questions.
Instead of launching into a lecture on God's wrath.
Try asking, what comes to mind when you hear that phrase? Does it resonate with you? Or does it feel out of step with who you believe God to be?
Those open-ended questions can lead to some really insightful conversations.
They can, and you might be surprised by the honesty of the responses you receive.
Now, when it comes to teaching children about Romans 1.132, we obviously need a different approach.
Right, we can't just throw them into a theological debate about justification by faith.
Their eyes would probably glaze over.
But that doesn't mean we have to water down the message either.
We can still talk about the big ideas.
Just in a way that's age-appropriate.
We can use simple language, relatable examples, stories.
Remember that analogy we talked about earlier, the one with the child breaking the vase?
Oh yeah, that was a good one.
That could be a great starting point for a conversation about God's forgiveness.
It illustrates that idea that we can't earn our way back into God's good graces. We need His grace.
Exactly. And we can also use stories from the Bible.
Especially those that highlight the consequences of bad choices and the power of forgiveness.
The story of Jonah is a classic example.
Running away from God, getting swallowed by a giant fish.
But ultimately experiencing God's mercy and second chances.
Kids love that story.
And it teaches some profound truths about God's character.
It's all about finding those touch points that connect with a child's world.
And don't be afraid to let them ask questions.
Oh yeah, kids are full of questions.
Sometimes they ask the most profound questions, the ones that make us really stop and think.
Like, if God knows everything, why does He let bad things happen?
That's a big one.
But it opens up a whole conversation about free will, suffering, the mystery of God's plan.
It's amazing how those simple questions can lead to such deep discussions.
Now, as we wrap up this deep dive into Romans 1.132,
I think it's important to emphasize one key point.
what's that?
This passage isn't meant to be a checklist of rules or a source of condemnation.
It's not about scaring people into following God.
No, it's about revealing His heart.
His love, His mercy, His desire for a relationship with us.
It's an invitation to experience the fullness of life that He offers.
through faith in Jesus Christ.
It's good news, even when it's hard to hear.
Well said. I think we've given our listeners some valuable tools and insights,
For engaging with this powerful passage,
and for sharing its message with others.
hopefully in a way that's both thought-provoking and grace-filled.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope it inspires our listeners to keep diving deeper into the Word,
To keep asking questions, keep seeking truth.
and to keep sharing what they discover with others.
Because that's how faith grows.
And that's how lives are transformed.
One conversation at a time.
Until next time, keep diving deep, folks.